I am William Hart, 63 years old, and the night my daughter-in-law told me I didn't belong at her dinner table was the night I learned my home was being sold behind my back. Jessica stood in the doorway with one hand on her hip, staring at my flannel shirt, as if it had insulted her. "You're really wearing that?" she asked. I looked down. It was clean, faded, and older than her marriage to my son. I wasn't aware there was a dress code. "Not for you," she said, her smile tightening. "For the people coming tonight." David appeared behind her, holding his phone. He wouldn't look at me. That hurt more than the insult. Silence was how my son avoided choosing sides. I picked up my truck keys and walked out. The engine started on the second try. As dinner guests began arriving at David and Jessica's house across town, I drove toward the office of Charles Thompson, the landlord who had been calling me for weeks. I'd ignored every message, assuming he wanted to discuss some routine repair. Now I wondered whether Jessica had known exactly what those calls meant. Thompson's office sat behind a row of small rental properties near the edge of town. One light burned above the front window when I pulled in. I watched my headlights reflect in the glass, then went inside. The bell rattled overhead. Thompson looked up from a stack of folders and removed his glasses. "Bill," he said, "you finally came. I should have come sooner." He reached beneath the desk and set a thick manila folder in front of me. "You need to see this before you go home." The first page was a copy of the long-term lease for the house where I'd lived for nearly 11 years. Thompson owned the property. I knew that. What I didn't know was that someone had submitted a second agreement to a title company, one claiming I had authorized the sale. At the bottom was a signature bearing my name. I stared until the letters blurred. It looked close enough to fool someone who had never watched me sign a document, but the final stroke was wrong. I always lifted my pen before the last line. Whoever copied it hadn't known that. "That isn't my signature." "I know." Thompson slid the original lease across the desk. I compared them. Seeing both pages together settled something inside me. I hadn't imagined the threat. Jessica's contempt wasn't simple arrogance. It was part of a plan. "Why would she do this?" I asked. Thompson opened another section of the folder. "She's in serious debt. Gambling mostly. Casino withdrawals, unpaid credit cards, collection notices. She owes more than $40,000. I read the statements in silence. Several withdrawals came from an account David and Jessica shared. The dates matched the weeks Jessica had begun pressuring me to sign updated housing paperwork. She'd called it a convenience. I'd trusted her enough not to ask questions. That trust now felt like a weapon I'd handed her. What does David know? Maybe everything, maybe nothing, but the forged power of attorney lists him as the person who requested it. The answer landed harder than the debt. My son avoided conflict, but I'd believed there were limits to what he would allow. Apparently, I'd never tested them. Thompson handed me a photocopy of the power of attorney. It claimed I was physically and mentally unable to manage my property and had appointed Jessica to handle the sale. The wording was formal, polished, and completely false. I'd passed a physical 2 months earlier. I still remembered the nurse complaining because I read every line before signing. "She has a buyer," Thompson said. "The closing is set for next Friday." How can a title company accept this? They may not have yet, but someone is pushing the paperwork through. If the buyer has paid a deposit, Jessica will be desperate to keep the deal alive. For the first time, I could see the shape of the fight. She had a deadline, but so did I. Thompson wrote a name on a yellow legal pad. Robert Keller, real estate and fraud attorney. Call him tonight. I folded the paper into my wallet. Should I confront her? No. Go home. Act normal. If she knows you're aware, she'll destroy whatever evidence she can. Every part of me wanted to march into Jessica's dinner party and place the forged document beside her wineglass. But my father had taught me that anger was useful only after it had been organized. Years in the military had reinforced that lesson. I tucked the folder beneath my jacket and walked out calmly. During the 15-minute drive home, I replayed my conversations with Jessica since her marriage to David. She'd criticized my truck, my clothes, and the repairs I did myself. She'd told neighbors I was becoming forgetful. I'd dismissed it as vanity. Now I understood she'd been building a story about me, one where I was too old to protect myself. The house was dark when I entered. The dinner I'd prepared before leaving sat untouched and cold. David and Jessica had returned to their own home without a message or apology. I locked my bedroom door and opened the folder again. The original lease showed I had another 19 years under a protected rental agreement. Jessica couldn't sell the property, and removing me without proper notice would violate the contract. Thompson was willing to testify. The home she wanted was not legally hers to sell. I called Robert Keller. His voicemail answered after 3 rings. "My name is William Hart," I said. "I believe someone forged a power of attorney and is attempting to sell the house where I live. I have the original lease and copies of the forged documents. Please call me tonight." I set down the phone and turned off the lamp. For several minutes, the only sound was the refrigerator cycling in the kitchen. Then my phone buzzed. The message came from an unknown number. "Bill, this is Charles. She knows you were at my office. Don't open your door. She's heading there now." I read it twice. Outside, headlights swept across my bedroom wall and disappeared. A moment later, tires rolled over the gravel driveway. Then someone tried my front door key. I heard the sirens before Jessica finished her toast. She stood at the head of the table, one hand raised, a crystal glass trembling between her fingers. David sat beside Patricia, his face pale beneath the dining room light. I had seen him nervous before, but never like that. This wasn't the anxiety of an awkward family dinner. It was the fear of someone who knew exactly what was about to happen. Jessica turned toward the open front door. "What is that?" I kept my hands folded in my lap. "It sounds like a celebration." Her eyes moved to me, and her smile vanished. 2 police cars stopped outside. Red and blue lights washed across the windows, and the expensive dishes Jessica had arranged for her victory dinner. A 3rd vehicle pulled in behind them, and Robert Keller stepped out with a uniformed officer. Patricia set down her wineglass. "Jessica, what did you do?" Jessica ignored her and looked at David. "Call someone." "Who?" he asked quietly. She stared at him as though he had failed an important test. Then she walked toward the door, but I stood before she reached it. "Please move, William." No, that was the first reward I allowed myself. Not because I had blocked the door, but because I had finally stopped feeling guilty for doing it. For most of my life, I had confused patience with weakness. I thought keeping quiet made me a good father and an agreeable man. Instead, it taught people they could push me without consequences. Jessica had mistaken my silence for permission. Keller entered with Detective Morgan, a woman in her 40s carrying a folder. The officer remained near the doorway. "Mrs. Hart," Detective Morgan said, "we need to speak with you about a real estate transaction involving William Hart." "This is a private family matter," Jessica said. "No," Keller replied. "It stopped being private when you submitted forged documents to a title company." The room went still. David looked at me. "Dad." I didn't answer. I wanted him to understand that this wasn't a misunderstanding I could smooth over in the kitchen. Jessica gave a short laugh. That is an outrageous accusation. Keller opened his folder. We have the original lease, a notarized statement from Harold Mills, who witnessed its signing, and a preliminary report from the title company identifying irregularities in the power of attorney. Jessica's face tightened. The power of attorney was signed by William. It was not, Keller said. She looked at me, searching for the old version of me, the man who would grow uncomfortable, lower his voice, and ask everyone to calm down. I gave her nothing. Detective Morgan continued. The signature was submitted under your name, but it doesn't match Mr. Hart's verified signatures. More importantly, the document attempts to authorize the sale of property you don't own. Patricia pushed back from the table. You said the house belonged to him. Jessica turned on her. Don't start. I asked you 3 times, Patricia said, her voice shaking. You said William was too old to manage it and had agreed to sell. I felt no satisfaction. Patricia had enjoyed Jessica's confidence and accepted the benefits that came with it, but she hadn't forged my name, not as far as I knew. David stood slowly. Jessica, what did you sign? She gave him the look she used when she wanted to make him feel responsible for her choices. Nothing that concerned you. That's not an answer. It was supposed to help us, she snapped. The sale would clear the debts and we could finally move forward. Keller glanced at Detective Morgan. What debts? Jessica's silence answered him. The detective removed another document from her folder. Our financial crimes unit is also reviewing transfers from an account connected to the proposed sale. Approximately $48,000 was paid as a deposit to a company controlled by Patricia Hart. Patricia's mouth fell open. I never received that money. You did, Detective Morgan said. It was transferred to an account in your name, then withdrawn in several cash transactions. Patricia looked at Jessica. Jessica looked at David. David looked at the floor. The lie hadn't been small. It had spread through everyone at that table, and each of them had chosen not to ask where the money came from. Jessica stepped toward me. William, listen to me. This can still be fixed. No, I said. It can be investigated. Her anger shifted into pleading. You're my family. I was your family when you mocked my clothes. I was your family when you used my son to pressure me. I was your family when you tried to sell a house you had no right to sell. David closed his eyes. The officer moved closer as Detective Morgan read Jessica her rights. Jessica tried to interrupt twice, then began crying when the handcuffs appeared. I had expected triumph, but watching her wrists come together produced only a tired emptiness. Keller touched my elbow. You did the right thing. I'm not sure it feels that way. It rarely does when the person being arrested is related to you. Jessica was led outside. Patricia followed after being told she wasn't under arrest, though she would need to come to the station for questioning. At the doorway, she stopped and looked back at the table. All this for a house, she whispered. I answered honestly. No. All this because you believed my life was something you could take. After they left, David remained seated. The candles had burned low, and Jessica's untouched food sat on the table. He looked older than 38, as though the last hour had stripped years from him. Dad, he said, I didn't know about the forged signature. But you knew about the sale. He swallowed. She told me you agreed. You never asked me. I was afraid to. I nodded. Fear explains a choice. It doesn't erase it. He covered his face with both hands. I wanted to comfort him, to tell him we could rebuild our relationship. but I had spent too many years repairing damage I hadn't caused. Keller gathered the documents. Mr. Hart, the title company froze the transaction this afternoon. The house is protected for now, but there's one more issue. What issue? The buyer who was supposed to close next week isn't an innocent party. He has already filed a claim against you for breach of contract. My stomach tightened. Against me. Keller handed me a new envelope. He says Jessica promised him possession by Friday. According to this notice, he's coming to your house tomorrow morning with a moving crew. I opened the envelope. The first line read, Notice of eviction and immediate possession. Beneath the buyer's signature, I saw a name I recognized. It belonged to the man who had witnessed my original lease. I am William Hart, 63 years old, and I never expected a flannel shirt to start a war inside my family. Yet that was exactly what happened. I stood in my living room, wearing the same clean, faded shirt I had owned for 20 years, when my daughter-in-law, Jessica, looked me over as if I were something unpleasant on the floor. "You're not coming to dinner dressed like that, are you, Dad?" she asked. "You'll embarrass us." Her words landed harder than I wanted to admit. I had spent most of my life around men who swallowed pain quietly, and I had carried that habit into old age, so I said nothing. I picked up my keys, walked past my son David without looking at him, and drove to the office of the one man who had been trying to warn me for weeks. Frank Thompson owned the rental property where I lived. I called him my landlord, but our friendship went back farther than either of us liked to calculate. We had served together overseas, then worked side by side in construction when we came home. During the drive, I kept wondering why he had called so often. I had assumed it was about a lease renewal or some ordinary repair. That assumption now felt shameful. Frank waited beneath a buzzing fluorescent light, a thick folder open on his desk. He skipped coffee and small talk, pushing the folder toward me. "You need to read this before you go to dinner." Inside were copies of a power of attorney, a property agreement, and a proposed sale contract. My name appeared on several pages, but the signature was wrong. The letters leaned at an angle I had never used, and even the pressure of the ink looked unfamiliar. Jessica had been preparing to sell the house where I lived, using documents that made it appear I had authorized her to act for me. I read the pages twice before the meaning settled in. The sale proceeds would be divided between a buyer and an account connected to Jessica. Frank had also found records showing she owed nearly $80,000 to a casino in Indiana. My hands stopped shaking when I understood the truth. The house was not being sold to improve my future. It was being sold to rescue hers. "How long have you known?" I asked. "Long enough to worry," Frank said. "Not long enough to stop her without your help." I looked at the forged signature. "Why didn't you tell me directly?" "I tried. You didn't answer." That was true. I had ignored his calls because I did not want to believe anything was wrong. Jessica had always been cold, but I explained it away as a personality difference. David had always been quiet, but I called that patience. Sometimes denial does not feel like weakness. Sometimes it feels like loyalty. Then Frank told me something I had not expected. The house was not mine. I had built it, maintained it, and believed I owned it. But years earlier, after my wife's medical bills overwhelmed us, I had sold the land to Frank. He let me remain there under a long-term lease and never demanded rent while I recovered. I remembered the transaction vaguely, buried beneath hospital visits and grief. But I had convinced myself that paying off the mortgage afterward meant the property had returned to me. "The deed has always been in my name," Frank said. Your lease protects you for another 19 years. Jessica can't sell the house, and she can't remove you. The truth humiliated me, but it also gave me something I had not felt in years: solid ground. Frank showed me the original lease, properly signed and witnessed. He had already contacted an attorney, Robert Keller, who advised me to attend the dinner, say little, and let Jessica explain her scheme in her own words. I drove home with the folder on the passenger seat. The house was quiet when I arrived, and the dinner Jessica had demanded I attend had already gone cold on my kitchen table. David and Jessica had left without a note. I thought about every time she had called my home an eyesore, and every time my son had lowered his head instead of defending me. Then I changed back into the flannel shirt. I did it deliberately, not to provoke her, but to stop feeling ashamed of something that had never been shameful. The shirt was old, clean, and comfortable. Jessica's opinion had no authority unless I gave it authority. At 7, I drove to David's house. Jessica opened the door in a black dress and a carefully practiced smile. Her eyes dropped to my shirt, and the smile weakened, but she stepped aside. "William," she said, "you came." I said I would. Inside, the dining room had been arranged to impress someone. Candles stood between polished glasses, expensive gifts were displayed on a side table, and Patricia, Jessica's mother, sat at the head of the table as if she had been appointed judge of the evening. David sat across from me, pale and uncomfortable, while Jessica moved around the room, explaining how costly everything had been. I placed my phone beside my plate with the screen turned down. The recorder was already running. Frank had warned me not to rely on a single recording, but one clear admission could still help establish what Jessica believed and what she had planned. Jessica raised her glass. "To new beginnings." I left mine on the table. She noticed, then continued. "The house sale is almost complete. The buyer is prepared to close, and the paperwork has been handled. Once William moves into something smaller, we'll finally have room to make proper investments." David shifted. "Jessica, we should probably talk about this privately." "Privately," she said. "We've talked about it for months. Your father knows he can't maintain that place forever." I kept my voice even. "What paperwork did you handle?" Her expression changed for half a second. "The power of attorney you gave me." "I don't remember giving you one." "You signed it," she replied. "You're just forgetting things now." Patricia lifted her glass. "There's no reason to make an unpleasant scene. Everyone is trying to help you." I looked at David. Did I sign anything? He stared at his plate. His silence answered more than he could. Jessica leaned toward me. "You should be grateful. We're giving you a chance to leave with dignity." I stopped the recording and picked up my phone. "No, you're giving me evidence." The room went still. Jessica's face lost its color, and David finally looked at me. I had expected anger, but what I saw in his eyes was fear. "You can't threaten me," Jessica said. "I'm not threatening you," I told her. "I'm informing you that I know." She laughed, but the sound was thin. "You have nothing." I stood and walked toward the door. For the first time since she entered our family, Jessica did not tell me where I belonged. She simply watched me leave, unable to control the ending. Outside, the October air felt colder than before. Then my phone buzzed. The message was from Frank. "She's meeting the buyer tomorrow at 10 a.m. Bring your lease. And William, don't go alone." I read it again. Then another message appeared beneath it, from a number I did not recognize. "The buyer already has a key to your house." The diner was one of those places time had forgotten, with cracked red booths and coffee that tasted as if it had been sitting on the burner since sunrise. Frank Thompson sat across from me, both hands wrapped around his mug, while my folder remained closed between us. "She's meeting the buyer tomorrow at 10, Frank said. "The title company is downtown. A friend of mine works at the front desk. He'll call when Jessica arrives." I nodded. "And the debt?" Frank lowered his voice. "Her creditor is Vince Coletti. He runs illegal gambling rooms around Columbus. Jessica owes him more than she can pay." "How much?" "40,000, maybe more. The amount keeps changing with the interest." Inside my folder were copies of the forged power of attorney, the proposed sale agreement, and my original lease. They were enough to stop the sale, but not enough to explain why Jessica had risked everything over one house. "She thinks the closing money will solve her problem," Frank continued. "Once she gets paid, she plans to leave town with David. And if the sale fails, Coletti starts looking for her." That was no victory. A woman in debt to a criminal was not something to celebrate. Still, grim relief settled over me. Jessica had spent weeks treating my home like a number on a spreadsheet. Now I understood that her desperation had become part of the trap. "What do we do tomorrow?" I asked. "Your attorney has already contacted the title company. They won't release the funds. The police will be there if she presents the forged documents." Frank glanced toward the window. "But be careful. If she realizes you know before she signs anything, she may destroy the evidence or run." I followed his gaze. A silver sedan sat at the far end of the lot, its engine running, exhaust drifting behind it. I recognized the car immediately. "David followed me," I said. Frank's expression hardened. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure." I slipped the folder into my jacket and stood. Before I could leave, Frank caught my wrist. "Don't threaten him," he said. "He may be weak, but he's still your son." "I'm not going to threaten him." Outside, the October air tightened my throat. Dry leaves scraped across the parking lot beneath my boots. As I approached the sedan, the driver's window lowered, revealing David behind the wheel, both hands fixed at 10 and 2. "Dad," he said, "I need to talk to you." "You followed me." He looked at the steering wheel. "Jessica wanted to know where you were going." "And you agreed to find out." "I didn't want to come, but she kept asking questions." He looked exhausted, not angry. That made it harder to stay cold. For most of his life, David had been the child who apologized before anyone asked him to. "She forged my signature," I said. "She tried to sell a house she doesn't own." He flinched. "She said you gave her permission." "Did you ever ask me?" "No." The answer hung between us. I pulled out the folder and handed it to him. "Then read this." David took it reluctantly and stood beside the open door while the wind turned the pages in his hands. I watched confusion become disbelief, then panic. His breathing changed before he reached the last page. "I didn't know," he said. "You knew about the sale. She told me you wanted to move into assisted living. She said the house was being sold, so you'd have money for medical care. I told you I was getting older. I never told you I was helpless." David closed the folder, his fingers trembling. "I swear, Dad, I didn't know she forged anything." It was the first honest thing he had said to me in months, and it hurt more than his silence. "Now you do." He glanced toward the diner. "What happens tomorrow?" "The sale is stopped. The documents go to the police. Jessica answers for the forgery." His face tightened. "You're having her arrested." "She chose to commit the crime. I didn't choose it for her. I can't let her go to prison. You may not be able to stop that. She's my wife. And I'm your father." Fear filled his eyes. "What do you want me to do?" Stop protecting a lie. Call off the sale, tell her you know, and bring me every document she has. She'll never listen. Then stop pretending this is about keeping the peace. The words landed harder than I intended. David lowered his head, and for once, did not defend her. I saw him struggling with the same weakness that had allowed Jessica to control every decision in their marriage. After a long silence, he said, "If I help you, she'll hate me. She already believes you belong to her." He stared at the folder. "I need time." "You have until tomorrow morning." David got back into the sedan, but did not start it immediately. I returned to the diner, where Frank waited with his untouched coffee. "Well?" he asked. "He knows." "Does he believe you?" "He believes the documents. I'm not sure he believes he can live with what they mean." "That comes later," Frank said. I sat across from him. For the first time since Jessica had humiliated me in my own living room, I felt the balance shift. I still had my lease, my attorney, and a clear record of what she had attempted. More importantly, David had finally seen the truth for himself. Frank reached into his coat and placed a small envelope on the table. "What's that?" "A copy of the message Coletti sent her yesterday. He warned that if she missed the payment, he'd expose her gambling accounts to the police." I opened the envelope. The message was brief, but the threat was unmistakable. Jessica had not only forged my signature, she had been racing against a deadline. I folded the page and added it to the evidence. "Tomorrow, she'll think she's walking into a sale. She'll be walking into a controlled meeting," Frank said. "Your attorney will be there. So will the detective." I looked through the window. David's sedan was gone, leaving only dark tire marks on the damp pavement. I wanted to believe he had made the right choice. I wanted to believe the son I remembered was still somewhere inside the frightened man Jessica had created. Before I could decide whether to call him, my phone rang. It was David. I answered. "What happened?" His breathing was uneven. "Dad, I went home." "Are you safe?" I found another folder in Jessica's office. There are more signatures in it, yours and someone else's. "Whose?" He didn't answer right away. In the background, I heard a door slam. Then David whispered, "She knows I took them. She's standing behind me with a gun." I arrived at the title company at 9:45, my heart pounding harder than it had during any business meeting. The plain brick office on Main Street looked like the kind of place where people signed papers, believing the documents told the whole truth. I parked, kept both hands on the wheel, and reminded myself I wasn't there to argue with Jessica. I was there to let her talk. The recorder in my breast pocket was already running. Frank had tested it with me 3 times that morning. Before I left his office, Robert Keller gave me one final instruction. Don't provoke her. Ask simple questions and let her explain what she thinks she's doing. Inside, the receptionist directed me to conference room B. The heating system hummed, and old coffee lingered near the front desk. I opened the door. Jessica sat at the far end of an oak table, dressed for a charity luncheon. Beside her was a thin man in a grey suit, his briefcase open. He introduced himself as Harrison, the notary, though he never quite met my eyes. David sat beside Jessica, pale and rigid, his hands folded in his lap. "William," Jessica said brightly, "I was beginning to think you might not come." I said I would. "That's a good start." She smiled. "We can finish this quickly." I took the chair across from her, the recorder pressed against my chest, a small reminder that I had finally stopped trusting my family's explanations. For 2 years, I had accepted excuses about paperwork, repairs, and delayed payments because I wanted peace more than answers. That morning, peace was no longer an option. Jessica slid a document toward me. This is the power of attorney you signed last month. I studied the signature. It resembled mine, but the letters leaned too far right, and the final stroke was heavier. I knew my handwriting. I had never signed that paper. I don't remember signing it. Her smile tightened. You were tired. I told you it was for the property records. I would remember giving you authority over my home. You don't remember a lot anymore. The insult landed quietly, which made it worse. Being told by my daughter-in-law that I was becoming incompetent made me wonder how many others believed her. Harrison cleared his throat. The document is notarized, sir. It appears valid. Were you present when I signed it? His face changed. Ms. Hart brought it to my office. And I was there? No, sir. The room went still. It wasn't a victory, but it was a crack in the wall Jessica had built around herself. She had brought a crooked signature and a nervous accomplice, believing a stamp could make the lie respectable. Jessica turned on him. You said this was sufficient. I said I was told you had authorization. Who told you? I asked. She answered before he could. This is ridiculous. We're trying to help you. By selling the house? By finding a solution you can afford. She tapped the papers. There are repairs you can't manage. The sale gives you money and puts you somewhere safer. Where would I live? We'll find you an apartment. She made my life sound like an inconvenience she had agreed to store temporarily. I thought of Martha, my wife, and the last Christmas she spent in that house. Jessica had criticized our furniture, our food, and the old flannel shirt I wore while cooking. Later, Martha stood at the sink and said, "She doesn't want a family, William. She wants access." I had defended Jessica then, telling Martha she was being unfair. That memory hurt more than Jessica's insult. Sign the deed, Jessica said. The buyer is waiting. I want the buyer's information first. It's in the file. Then show me. Jessica glanced at Harrison. He shifted papers inside his briefcase, his hands trembling. There's no reason to delay, she said. There's every reason. Her expression hardened. You think you're clever because you hired a lawyer? No. You're an old man in a worn-out shirt, William. You have no idea what you're doing. I kept my hands flat on the table. The recorder captured every word. Then she mentioned Martha. Your wife would be ashamed of the way you're behaving. For several seconds, I heard nothing but blood rushing in my ears. My hand tightened around the table's edge. I wanted to shout, to defend Martha's memory, but Keller's instruction returned to me. Let her explain. I picked up the pen, then set it down. I'm not signing. Jessica stared. You don't have a choice. If I don't, why are you asking? The power of attorney gives me authority. Then sign for me. That finally broke her composure. She slammed her palm on the table, making Harrison jump. You will sign, she said, or I'll make certain you regret refusing me. I reached into my pocket, removed the recorder, and stopped it. Then I set it between us. I think I have enough. Jessica went pale. Harrison stood so quickly that his chair struck the wall. I didn't know it was forged, he said. Jessica spun toward him. Be quiet. You notarized a document without the signer present. I told you he had authorized me. And you believed that? I asked. Harrison looked down. He had no answer, and neither did Jessica. The room no longer belonged to her. For once, her confidence wasn't controlling the conversation. It was evidence. The door opened behind me. 2 uniformed officers entered with Detective Morris. the investigator Frank had contacted. Jessica turned toward them, trying to arrange her face into authority. "What is this?" she demanded. Detective Morris held up a folder. "Jessica Hart, you're under arrest for forgery, fraud, and attempted theft of property." "No." He began reading her rights. David remained seated, staring at the table as though he wanted to disappear beneath it. When the handcuffs closed around Jessica's wrists, she finally looked at him. "Tell them this is my house," she said. David swallowed. "Jessica, stop. You know it is. It isn't." Her eyes moved to me, bright with fury. "He has no right to it either. It's rented. The house is rented." The detective stopped and turned toward me. The room tilted, not because Jessica had exposed the lease, but because I understood what she had done. If the house wasn't mine, then every statement I had made about ownership would be examined. Detective Morris stepped closer. "Sir, is that true?" he asked. "You said the house was yours. Now we need to verify who legally owns it." Detective Morris's question hung in the room. I looked at Jessica, then David, and finally at the folder containing the lease I had signed nearly 20 years earlier. "I said it was my house because I paid for it," I answered, "but the deed was never transferred into my name." Jessica gave a sharp, satisfied laugh. "So you lied?" "No, I was careless about the difference." That distinction mattered more than I understood. I had bought the property from an old friend, Walter Crane, who planned to move to Arizona after his wife died. We agreed on a price, and I paid in installments over 3 years. Walter let me move in immediately, but the final transfer was delayed when his title company found an error in the original records. Then Walter became ill, and I assumed his attorney had fixed it. Assumptions are expensive. I had spent years believing the house was mine because I had paid for it, maintained it, and built my life there. Jessica had found the weakness in that belief before I questioned it. Detective Morris opened the folder. "Mr. Hart, we need to separate the criminal issue from ownership. The forged power of attorney is serious, but the title still has to be verified." "I understand." Jessica straightened. "You see, he doesn't own anything." David finally looked up. "Jessica, you forged his signature. I was trying to help us. You told me the deed was already in his name." She turned on him, "Because that's what he told everyone." I felt the old urge to defend my son, followed by the memory of his silence at the dinner table. I had spent years mistaking David's weakness for kindness. That night, I began to understand that kindness without courage could become another form of betrayal. Detective Morris took Jessica into custody. She protested until the front door closed behind her, but the officers did not argue. For once, her voice could not control the room. David and I were left with the detective and a legal problem larger than the fraud. Morris told us to contact an attorney immediately. I called Robert Keller from the kitchen, and he answered on the second ring. "Do not sign anything," he said after I explained. "I'm coming over." Keller arrived 40 minutes later with Ellen Price, a grey-haired attorney who specialized in real estate disputes. She listened as I described Walter, the payments, and the long-term lease. When I finished, she asked, "Do you have the original agreement?" "Yes." "Proof of payment?" "I have bank records." "Then we may have more than a lease." Under the yellow kitchen light, Ellen examined the documents. The lease granted me possession for 25 years, with an option to purchase the property for the exact amount I had already paid. The final page bore Walter's signature and a handwritten note stating that the sale would be completed once the title error was corrected. "This shows intent," Ellen said. tapping the note. But we still need proof Walter accepted full payment. I know who can help. I called Frank Thompson, my oldest friend and owner of the rental company that had collected my payments. He arrived shortly before midnight carrying a metal document box. I knew this day might come, Frank said. He placed the original lease, a payment ledger, a letter from Walter, and a notarized statement on the table. The letter explained that I had paid for the house in full and that the transfer had been delayed by a clerical error involving a missing estate document. Walter wrote that the property was morally and financially William Hart's, even though the county records had never been corrected. Ellen read the statement twice. "This doesn't make you the record owner today," she said, "but it gives us a strong claim for equitable title. More importantly, Jessica had no authority to sell the property, and the buyer should have discovered that." Frank leaned back. "The buyer is connected to her gambling debts. The documents did not erase my mistake, but they proved I had not invented my right to live there. Jessica had tried to turn a paperwork problem into a weapon. Now that same paperwork could expose her." The next morning, Keller filed an emergency motion to stop the sale and any attempt to remove me from the property. Ellen sent the title company copies of the lease, payment records, and Walter's statement. By noon, the closing had been suspended. At the police station, I sat across from Detective Morris, waiting for news while David waited in the hallway. Jessica had refused to speak without an attorney, but evidence found in her office supported charges of forgery and attempted fraud. Morris slid a photograph across the desk. It showed the forged power of attorney beside a second document authorizing the buyer to take possession of my house. "She signed your name twice," he said. "Who witnessed it?" "We're still confirming that." The signature looked close enough to fool someone who wanted to believe it. That hurt most. Jessica had relied on people accepting the version of me she had created. Old, confused, and too tired to challenge her. When Morris finished questioning me, David entered. He looked as if the last 24 hours had stripped years from him. "Dad," he said, his eyes filling, "I didn't know about the forged signature." "But you knew about the sale." He swallowed. "She told me you agreed. You never asked me." "I was afraid to." I nodded slowly. "Fear explains a choice. It doesn't erase it." He covered his face with both hands. I wanted to comfort him, but I had spent too many years repairing damage I had not caused, so I let him sit with the truth. Outside, Keller handed me a copy of the court order. The sale was frozen, and the buyer was forbidden to enter my property. Ellen had begun correcting the title, using Walter's letter and the payment records to establish my claim. For the first time, I believed I might keep my home, not because Jessica had failed, but because I had finally stopped trusting other people to protect what was mine. David wiped his eyes. "Can I come home with you?" I studied him. "You can come by. We'll talk." He nodded, accepting the boundary, even though it wounded him. My phone rang before we reached the parking lot. The number was unfamiliar, but I answered. A man said, "William Hart?" "Yes." "Your daughter-in-law owes me $200,000. I stopped walking. "You're her next of kin," he continued. "Pay the debt, or you'll regret what happens next." The call ended. Then a text arrived with a photograph attached. It showed my front door, taken from the driveway that morning. Beneath it were 6 words. "We know where your son lives. I am William Hart, 63 years old, and I learned that a threat becomes more dangerous when it arrives with a photograph." The picture showed my front door, taken from the driveway that morning, with 6 words beneath it. "We know where your son lives. I read the message twice before showing it to David. His face tightened, but he did not look surprised. That hurt more than the threat. "How long has this been going on?" I asked. He stared at the pavement. "Jessica borrowed money. At first she said it was for the business, then she said it was to cover a bad investment. And you believed her?" I wanted to. I understood. I had spent years believing the version of my son that was easiest to love. David was weak, but he was not heartless. The problem was that weakness, left unchallenged, could become a kind of cooperation. I called Detective Morris and sent him the photograph. He told us not to respond, leave David's apartment, or confront anyone nearby. Then I called Frank Thompson, my oldest friend and the landlord whose documents had helped expose Jessica's fraud. Frank answered immediately. "Get David inside. Lock everything." "We're already there." "Good. I'm calling the police and heading over." David looked at me. "They're going to come here." "They may," I said, "but this time, we won't wait for them blindly." I had an old service pistol locked in a metal box beneath my bed. I had carried it during my military years and kept it legally secured after returning home. I brought the box out, checked the lock, and set it on the kitchen counter without opening it. David saw it and shook his head. "Dad, don't. Call the police again." "I already have." "Then leave the gun alone." "I am. I need to remember that protection and revenge aren't the same thing." I told the dispatcher exactly where the weapon was. She instructed me to keep it locked and untouched. I did. 20 minutes later, a dark SUV rolled slowly past the building. It reached the corner, stopped, and returned. No one got out. David's hands began to tremble. I covered one with mine. "Breathe. I should have told you sooner." "Yes." He flinched. I regretted the sharpness but not the truth. Frank arrived with 2 plainclothes officers. Using the military habits I had learned long ago, I helped them establish clear lines of sight without exposing ourselves. They placed a recording device near the entryway and told David to answer the door only if someone knocked. I stayed in the living room, out of view but close enough to hear. A few minutes passed. Then came 3 slow taps. David looked at me. I nodded once. He opened the door with the chain fastened. A broad man in a grey jacket stood outside, with another man behind him. Neither looked angry. That was what made them frightening. "David Hart?" the first man asked. "Who are you?" "Someone collecting a debt." "I don't owe you anything." The man smiled. "Your wife does. Families usually help each other." I stepped into view. "Leave the property." His eyes shifted toward me. "You must be William." "I am." "Then you understand how these things work." "I understand that you're trespassing and making a criminal threat." His smile vanished. "You should be careful with words. And you should be careful with cameras." Frank had placed one near the ceiling, aimed directly at the doorway. The officer was positioned behind the kitchen wall, listening. The man glanced upward, but too late. The second man moved toward the door. I heard the officer identify himself and order both men to raise their hands. For a moment, nobody moved. Then the first man turned, and the officer repeated the command with enough authority to end the hesitation. The arrests happened quickly. No one was struck, and no weapon was drawn. That mattered to me. I had spent too much of my life believing strength meant being the most dangerous person in the room. The police found ledgers and several phones in the SUV. One message connected the men to Jessica's gambling debt and showed that she had given them our addresses. Detective Morris later said the evidence supported charges for extortion and stalking. David sat at the kitchen table, pale and exhausted. She gave them our information, he said. Yes. She said she was trying to protect us. She was trying to protect herself. He covered his face. I let him. Comfort would have been easy, but easy was what had brought us there. Frank placed a folder in front of me. There's more. Inside were copies of Jessica's loan agreements, bank transfers, and messages with the lender. She had borrowed nearly $200,000, then promised him my house as collateral. The papers included another forged signature and a handwritten note stating that I would be removed after the sale. My anger was no longer confused. It had a shape, a date, and a paper trail. Detective Morris entered with a warrant. We're going to Jessica's house. If she has the original documents, we may recover them. David stood. I'm coming. Morris studied him. You understand that anything you say may be used in court? David nodded. I understand. That was the second victory. He was not suddenly brave or transformed into the son I wanted, but he had finally chosen the truth while it still cost him something. Jessica was waiting in her living room. She looked composed until Morris placed the financial records on the coffee table. You gave my address to men who threatened me, I said. She looked at David. This is your father's fault. He's trying to destroy us. No, David said. His voice shook, but he did not retreat. You did that. Jessica stared at him as if he had spoken another language. The officers searched the house and found the original loan file in a locked desk drawer. They also found a draft agreement transferring control of my rental contract to the lender. Jessica had not merely planned to sell a house she did not own. She had intended to use my legal protection as security for her private debt. Morris arrested her for fraud, forgery, and conspiracy to commit extortion. As the cuffs closed, she looked at me. You think this is over? No, I said. I think this is the first honest thing that has happened in a long time. By evening, the lender and both men from the SUV were in custody. The house was secure, David was staying with Frank temporarily, and my pistol remained locked where I had left it. I felt no triumph, only relief. The next morning, Patricia, Jessica's mother, waited on my porch with a check in her hand. She stood beside a black sedan, dressed as if she were attending a board meeting. Your daughter belongs in prison, I told her, not in my house. Patricia held out the check. Take this, William, walk away, and everyone can recover. I looked at the amount printed beneath her name. Then I saw the signature. It was mine. I am William Hart, 63 years old, and I used to believe a courtroom was a place where truth automatically mattered. I learned otherwise during the weeks before Jessica's trial. Truth mattered, but only if someone had the patience to document it, the money to defend it, and the courage to speak when a family member begged you to stay quiet. The house was still standing, and the attempted sale had been cancelled. My lease was protected. The forged power of attorney had been entered into evidence, and the property was legally transferred into my name. Jessica remained in county custody, while her attorney negotiated charges that could send her to prison for years. Those facts should have brought peace. Instead, I woke expecting another envelope, threat, or call from someone claiming Jessica owed money. David moved into a small apartment across town. He visited twice before trial, standing near the door as if he did not deserve to sit down. On his third visit, he placed the key to Jessica's office on my kitchen table. I should have stopped her, he said. I looked at the key. You should have asked me. His face tightened, but he nodded. That did not repair our relationship, yet it was the first honest conversation we had shared in years. I told him I would testify. He said he would too. That was the first reward I allowed myself. Not forgiveness, but clarity. I no longer had to carry the truth alone. Assistant District Attorney Karen Lewis met with me 2 days before jury selection. She reviewed the lease, forged authorization, lender's messages, and recording from the dinner where Jessica told me to leave my own home. She may claim this was a misunderstanding, Lewis said. She may say she believed you agreed to the sale. She knew I hadn't. I know, but the jury needs to hear how you know. Being right was not enough. I had to remember dates, conversations, signatures, and the small moments I had dismissed because I did not want to believe my son's wife could hurt me. On the first day of trial, Jessica entered wearing a grey suit and no jewellery. She looked smaller than I remembered, but I did not mistake that for remorse. When our eyes met, her expression was accusing, as though I had betrayed her by refusing to absorb the consequences of her choices. David sat directly behind me, his hands clasped tightly. He had asked whether I wanted him beside me. "You can sit wherever you need to sit," I told him. The prosecution presented the forged documents first. A handwriting expert explained that the signature on the power of attorney had been traced from an old insurance form. A title company employee testified that Jessica had posed as my legal agent and promised the buyer possession by the end of the month. Then Lewis played the dinner recording. Jessica's voice filled the courtroom. "You should be grateful. We're giving you a chance to leave with dignity." I remembered how small I had felt at that table. Hearing it again, I felt something different. The humiliation had not vanished, but it no longer belonged to me. It belonged to the person who caused it. On the witness stand, Lewis asked why I had trusted Jessica. "Because she was married to my son," I answered, "and I wanted family to mean something." The courtroom fell silent. I told them about my flannel shirt, the dinner, the threats, and discovering she had tried to sell a house she did not own. Jessica's attorney rose for cross-examination. "You were angry with my client, weren't you?" "Yes. You wanted revenge. I wanted my home protected. But you recorded her without telling her. I recorded one conversation after she threatened to remove me from my home. I gave it to the police. I did not use it to blackmail her." The attorney paused, hoping I would become defensive. I waited until he moved on. That was the second reward, standing before strangers and telling the truth without apologizing for being hurt. David testified the following afternoon. He admitted Jessica had told him I agreed to sell, but he had never asked me directly. He described the folder he found in her office and how she pressured him to sign documents he did not understand. His voice shook. "I chose peace in my marriage over fairness to my father." Jessica stared at him as if he had become a stranger. I knew that look. It was the same one she had given me when I stopped obeying her. The defense argued that Jessica's gambling addiction had clouded her judgment. Her attorney described unpaid loans, online betting, and threats from people demanding repayment. None of it excused her actions, though it explained her desperation. When Jessica addressed the court, she cried before finishing her second sentence. "I was trying to save my family." I looked at David. His eyes were closed. The jury returned its verdict in less than 3 hours. Guilty of forgery, fraud, and attempted theft of property. The judge sentenced Jessica to 4 years in state prison, followed by probation and restitution. There was no satisfaction in watching deputies lead her away, only tired sadness. A person had made hundreds of choices to reach that moment, and I had been one of those she hurt. Outside the courthouse, David hugged me. I stood stiffly for a moment, then wrapped my arms around him. "I'm sorry, Dad," he whispered. "I know. Can I come home sometimes?" "Sometimes," I said, "but we'll do it slowly." He accepted that, and we walked toward the parking lot beneath falling October leaves. I thought the story had finally ended. Then a young woman stepped away from a parked sedan. "Mr. Hart." I stopped. "Who are you?" "My name is Laura Bell. I'm Jessica's sister." She looked frightened, not angry. In her hand was a thick brown envelope. "My mother set this whole thing up," Laura said. "The gambling debt, the lender, even Jessica's first contact with the buyer." I stared at the envelope. Laura held it out. "She wanted Jessica to ruin you. And I have the proof." I took one step toward her, but before I could open it, Laura pointed past my shoulder. A black sedan was leaving the courthouse lot. "Don't let my mother know I told you," she said, "because she isn't finished."